On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we sit down with the author and journalist David Cay Johnson to discuss how corporations, as well as the wealthy, including figures like Donald Trump, have been able to carry out a de facto tax boycott.
Now, instead of flying first class, you can buy your own plane, and today you can have your own jumbo jet. What about two houses? Why don't you have 6 or 8 or 9 of them? And that's what the tax code has enabled in these changes. And then with it, and this is very important to Donald Trump, there's virtually no enforcement of the tax laws anymore.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism, truth is not, socialism, obedience, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. The release of an Access Hollywood video in which Donald Trump bragged about sexually assaulting women hit his faltering campaign like a tsunami. And it has only gotten worse. At least a half dozen women have since told several news outlets, including the New York Times, that Trump carried out unwanted groping and sexual advances. Trump has vehemently denied the charges. Trump has, in response, resurrected a 40-year-old rape charge against Bill Clinton. He invited women who accused the former president of sexual misconduct to the last debate. The sexual scandals, however, have diverted attention away from Trump's numerous business scandals. He routinely borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars he could not repay, and then stiffed partners, investors, and contractors, as well as workers. He and his associates have ruined the lives of thousands of people, including the 3,000 workers who lost their jobs earlier this week at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. RT correspondent Anya Parampil examines the way the tax codes has been rewritten to allow the rich, like Trump, to carry out a de facto tax boycott.
It's been discovered by the New York Times that Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump likely paid 0 income taxes for the last 18 years. But the most scandalous aspect of the story isn't necessarily that the man Forbes magazine estimates to be worth $3.7 billion paid 0 income taxes for nearly 2 decades, but that he did so legally. See, Trump didn't have to pay Uncle Sam because in 1995 he reported an income loss of over $900 million. And believe it or not, because of how our tax system is designed, that loss allowed him to avoid paying federal income taxes up to that same amount. It's a loophole only available to the ultra-rich. According to official tax brackets, single Americans making over $400,000 were meant to pay nearly 40% in income taxes in 2013. But according to the White House, that year the 400 richest taxpayers paid an average of 23% in income taxes thanks to loopholes. Comparatively, in 2013, middle-income Americans making around $36,000 to $87,000 were in the 25% tax bracket. That's because the system is actually designed to benefit the wealthy. For example, for wealthy investors in the stock market, gains are only taxed at 15%, meaning if you work for a living, you can be taxed up to 35%. But if you just have a ton of cash sitting on the market, you pay only up to 15%. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, keeping the capital gains tax low has cost the U.S. Treasury up to $474 billion between the years 2011 and 2015. But reality is the tax system as a whole favors the ultra-wealthy over the poor. For example, if you can afford a house, you get a tax break. Even better, if you can afford a vacation home, you get a second tax break. Donald Trump says he didn't pay any federal income taxes because he's, quote, smart. But the question is whether that's true or whether or not tax policies which favor the rich are simply not smart enough.
The Pulitzer Prize winning journalist David Cay Johnson is the author of Free Lunch: How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill, along with the making of Donald Trump. In his books and journalism, he details how government laws and regulations, especially tax codes, have been rewritten to legally permit corporations, as well as the rich, to engage in what has, in essence, become a tax boycott. Thank you, David.
Glad to be
here. I want to focus on 2 of your books, Free Lunch, the one I just mentioned, as well as your new book on Donald Trump. Because Trump is emblematic of the rise of an oligarchic elite that has rewritten the tax laws, the regulations. So there's a two-tiered system, which you document actually in the Trump book, one for them and one for us.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, we have created a society where we've been listening to rich people. I mean, that's the whole pitch Ronald Reagan made in 1980 was that we're not allowing business owners to enjoy the fruits of their labor. And that's because the tax laws basically said reinvest in the business, grow the business, that'll make you wealthier and it will create jobs. Reagan came along and said, no, let business owners take money out. Well, that destroys jobs. And now, instead of flying first class, you can buy your own plane. And today, you can have your own jumbo jet. What about two houses? Why don't you have 6 or 8 or 9 of them? And that's what the tax code has enabled in these changes. And then with it, and this is very important to Donald Trump, there's virtually no enforcement of the tax laws anymore.
You document that pretty well.
Yeah.
But you also, I mean, Clinton was as bad as Reagan on this in terms of giving tax breaks to...
He was, although I think the difference between the two of them is that Clinton walked in with what he was handed by the Congress he had and the social changes that had taken place, and then he went with it. He did bring about a tax increase in 1993, and following that tax increase, of course, we had the longest expansion in the history of the country, completely disproving the claim that if you raise taxes, you'll sink the economy.
Talk a little bit about the specifics. You know, what this means in terms of what corporations and what wealthy individuals such as Trump are able to carry out that they were not able to carry out in the past.
Well, many Americans now and multinational corporations, not domestic, but multinationals, literally turn a profit off the tax system. We've set up rules that allow companies through accounting to turn profits into what are temporarily expenses. Therefore, you don't pay phony expenses. You therefore don't pay the money to the government today. It's the equivalent of a zero-interest loan. So think about your paycheck. Imagine if the money taken out of your check for income taxes, the government said to you, well, tell you what, hang on to the money, invest it. You can't spend it, but go invest it. And 30 years from now, pay us the money, and you get to keep all the investment income.
And this is something Trump carried out.
Trump is a major beneficiary of this. In all likelihood, Donald Trump has not paid income taxes since 1978, or he's paid very little. We know he paid no income taxes in 78, 79, 84, 92, 94. We know in the last 3 years, he reported his income on his tax return as less than $500,000 because of a tax benefit that he got that's public record. But he's just part of a bigger problem.
Yeah,
Mitt Romney was the sole owner, not just the manager as most places reported, but the sole owner of Bain Capital Management. And if you're the manager of a private equity firm or a hedge firm, there are special rules that let you live tax-free if you choose to. Major athletes and executives can set aside unlimited amounts of money, while most Americans can only save outside the tax system $5,500 or $6,000 a year.
And one of the things we've seen with Trump, as well as other corporate and leaders and oligarchs, is that the system has been defanged, in essence. And you also document some of this in the Trump book.
Well, the number of employees at the IRS has been radically cut, even as Congress has made the system more and more complex. Congress has never funded properly a modern system, technological system. If we had a database of the kind that the NSA has, the CIA has, or Citibank and Chase Bank have, we could identify tax cheats very quickly with statistical techniques. But even when we do that, there'll be about 150 million individual tax returns filed this year. And the federal government will look at prosecuting about 1,600. It'll actually prosecute about 1,200. It's an insignificant number, and almost all of those will be either politicians who took bribes, because it's an easy way to get them out, or drug dealers.
And we have, what, 25% of Fortune 500 companies don't even pay taxes.
Well, in fact, they probably literally turn a profit off it. The accounting that's approved by the government is misleading because it doesn't show how they're profiting from these zero-interest loans. They don't pay the taxes, they invest the money, they keep the investment earnings. Then they say, oh, we paid this tax. Well, no, you really sort of gave a small slice back of the profits you made off the tax system. When I first reported that, the editors of the New York Times couldn't believe it.
Where we both worked.
Yeah, we both worked. They were just like, really? And, I persuaded them that this was correct, and then Congress undertook a study, 1,800 pages, 3 volumes, that showed I was spot on about this. But to this day, this is 15 years later, I still run into people who go, oh, that's not possible.
Right. Well, you talk about the political consequences of that, especially in your book, Free Lunch. It was written in 2007, I think.
Yeah, it came out at the end of 2007.
Right, which kind of warned about the rise of a figure like Trump. Right. And you said that, countries that create unfair tax systems ultimately fall into despotism.
That's right. One of the first signs that a society is losing its cohesion is widespread tax cheating. And we're seeing widespread tax cheating in the areas where you can cheat. Wage earners can't cheat. It's all taken out of their pay. Right. But individual entrepreneurs can. They have tightened up on investors, partly because of my work. But individual business owners still have massive opportunities to cheat. And we have all these incredibly complicated structures that Wall Street sells, whose purpose in large part is to avoid responsibility if things go wrong and to eliminate taxes. And underlying that is, I think, a deeper problem. Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech in 1963, said that I want my children to grow up in a world where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. What we've done since Ronald Reagan is create a society where we measure you by the presumed content of your wallet.
Right.
And so we have these, what are financial porn shows on television, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and the many that have followed, the Kardashian shows.
Well, Trump ran one.
Trump ran one, absolutely. And it is this worship of money. That's never gotten any society anywhere. If you look at the 6 noble purposes in the U.S. Constitution, establish justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, promote the general welfare, none of them have anything to do with getting rich. You get rich because you do the right set of rules that enable people to become rich. But that's not the purpose of the country or the government. And if that's the road you go down, eventually you will destroy your society, and I don't want to see that happen.
Wouldn't you say it's pretty far along?
I don't know. I don't know how resilient we are. The rise of Donald Trump, a man who talks as if the president is a dictator.
Right.
He says, I'm going to tell Nabisco and Ford where they can build factories. Right. And then the deafening silence of all the conservatives who've complained about government doing things like that in a much milder form, who says, I'm going to use nuclear weapons in Europe with countries who are our allies. A man who has no idea what the duties, powers, and limitations in the Constitution are, and who then says, I alone can solve your problems, an inherently anti-democratic statement. And yet he has unbelievably rabid fans, and he may be elected. I mean, doesn't appear likely, but he still could win election.
Great. When we come back, we'll hear more from Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author David Cay Johnson. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back. Let's continue our conversation with David Cay Johnston, author of The Making of Donald Trump. So, with this, as you correctly pointed out, rise of this ethos of one's worth is determined by one's financial prowess, also comes, and you do write about this in your book on Trump, this drive to become a celebrity, this constant self-promotion, myth-making, really, which Trump engages in.
Television, I think, has had an enormously negative impact. There was a book years ago called The Plug-in Drug, in encouraging people to think about their celebrity or their fame rather than the substance of what they do. And nobody has been more masterful at this than Donald Trump.
One of the interesting things, which is documented throughout Free Lunch with all sorts of, perhaps some of the wealthiest figures within the country, including Trump, is the way when they get into financial difficulty, the government bails them out.
Yeah, this is a really deep problem. First of all, we have all sorts of businesses that get their capital from the taxpayers, and they take it away from the schools and the police departments, and people don't seem to grasp that this is going on. Then when these enterprises, because they're not their own money in many cases, it's the taxpayers' money, are badly managed, they get bailed out by the government. Donald Trump got banks to loan him on his signature, like a credit card, over $900 million, and he had over $2.1 billion of other debt. Well, these banks didn't know that all the other banks had given him these loans. When they got in trouble, the state of New Jersey...
This is what you're talking about, his casino.
His casino business and his whole empire, but the whole thing was going to collapse. The state of New Jersey, which has the strongest governor in America by far, took Trump's side against his bankers. So the bankers had to eat losses, and they propped up Trump. He was the original too big to fail. I mean, I suppose you can go back to Lockheed in the 70s, but in our era, he's the original too big to fail. And government propped him up. If he had gone through the normal process, he would have gone through bankruptcy. Well, then we come along to the collapse in 2008, where there were people, including me, who wrote stories saying there's a housing bubble out there. There are other people who pointed to the dishonest practices that were going on. And the Bush administration goes to Congress and gets $700+ billion to bail them out. And the Obama administration refuses to prosecute these people, saying, President Obama saying, well, the way the laws are written, these are terrible, they're not crimes. No, wrong. Fraud is always and everywhere a crime, and if they'd wanted to, they could have put thousands of these bankers in jail and gotten real reform, but the system has been turned over to them because they're the source of the campaign money.
Well, you write in both your books about how the only people who usually get prosecuted are the people who carry out incredibly minor infractions. I think in the Trump book you mentioned she was a cocktail waitress or something.
There's a cocktail waitress who picked up a chip on the floor of the casino, and she was arrested at home, rousted in front of her children in the middle of the night and put in handcuffs. They brought a felony charge, judge threw it out. They brought a misdemeanor charge, judge threw it out. They went after her license, she kept it. In contrast to that, we had casino owners who were involved with helping money laundering and the Medellin drug cartel. We had
perhaps you can talk
Trump.
A little bit about that, because Trump had a very close relationship with some not only known figures of the mafia, including the Gotti crime family, right, but a very well-known drug trafficker.
Yes. Well, I don't know if he was well-known, but...
Well, certainly known by the feds.
Yes. There was a convicted felon and mob associate named Joe Wexelbaum. Donald Trump had to have helicopters. All casinos have helicopters. Instead of going to one of the well-established, well-funded helicopter companies, he went to this mob guy and had unusual, that I describe in my book, The Making of Donald Trump, financial relationships with him. When it turns out the guy's indicted as a major drug trafficker, Donald should have cut off all ties to him. A casino owner in New Jersey must show by clear and convincing evidence that he is honest and doesn't involve himself with mobsters. Trump went to bat for this guy. He wrote a letter pleading for mercy.
And his sister was the judge.
And mysteriously, the case was moved from Ohio to the federal judge who's his sister. Now, she removed herself, but put all the other judges on notice that they have a federal judge who goes around in helicopters owned by a drug trafficker. The mules who drove the drugs up to Ohio from Florida, 20 years. Right. This guy, Donald sought mercy for, 18 months. And when he comes out, he moves into Trump Tower. Where were the authorities about this?
Right.
Plus, he tried to cover up his involvement with this guy. So they had plenty of grounds to take away his casino license, but they didn't. They took care of Donald Trump.
Well, I think you speculate in the book that perhaps the reason he was consorting with a known drug dealer is that these high rollers who are given free sweets are given lots of other stuff.
Well, we don't know. Here's what we know. Donald Trump so desperately needed this guy, this drug trafficker, to be his friend and not his enemy, that he was willing to risk his casino license for him. So clearly there was something going on here. That is the single most important question no journalist but me has been raising in the 2016 American election.
Why is it that lie after lie, whether it's Trump University, you chronicle in the book the way he would license his name for a resort in Mexico where all the poor investors were fleeced.
Right.
So this is a pattern.
Right.
This is constant behavior.
Lifelong pattern.
Right. And why is he able to go out and almost untouched from?
Well, this is a real failing of the American news media. They're not vetting him. There's a lot. I don't understand why, because I started in the summer of last year writing articles aimed at journalists. Ask these questions.
Right.
I posed the questions for them, and none of them have been asked. There's an abundant record, but to do that, you've got to go find the court record. I'll be glad to give it to other journalists. You've got to understand how the court system works, and then you have to get to Trump. Or those organizations that wrote tough pieces about Trump, not TV, but print and online, he threw them out of his events. He's now let them back in, but he threw them out and sent a message. And this is a terrible failing of the American news business. It's going to lead to further degradations in the public's respect for journalists. It's very troubling for our democracy.
He brings in ratings and he brings in money.
Well, he's like watching not just a car wreck, but some car wreck where there's, wow, what's going to happen next? And people rubberneck.
I looked at your book, which I'd read several years ago, and had marked this passage. You said, revolutions unchecked bring violent change that destroys the good and the innocent. Karl Polanyi, one of the most influential anthropologists, wrote in his 1944 book, The Great Transformation, that the rise of fascism in the 30s and World War II resulted from masses of scared people with no sense of control over their economic destiny, acting in ways small and great from economic fear and the panic it induced. Better to elect leaders with the judgment to explore what can be done than to risk an economic disaster that brings forth leaders who will exploit our misfortune and, as happened in the 30s, scare us into relinquishing our liberty. Is that Trump?
Oh, yeah. That's exactly what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, I feel in this very strange position. I wrote 3 books laying this out to the American public, and how government policies people didn't ever know about till I wrote about them are taking from the many and giving to the rich. Trump comes along and says, I know why you're in trouble. It's the Mexicans, it's the Chinese, it's the this, it's the other.
Right.
And he's a demagogue. But to many people, that makes sense to them because they don't understand how government works.
Right.
Then you have dishonest news organizations. You have an American television channel I call Faux News, where it's so thoroughly documented that they either make things up or twist them into a pretzel. And yet you see people all over saying you can't trust the major news organizations. Well, they may not be as tough on them as I'd like, but yeah, you can trust them because they use verified facts. And Trump has exploited the economic terror that the bottom 50% of Americans are in. The bottom 90% of Americans, their income in 2014 was essentially the same as in 1967 once you adjust for inflation. 67 to 2014, right. Almost no change. All the growth way up here.
Right.
And Trump is exploiting that. The fraud is he's a man who's cheated workers, used illegal immigrants and cheated them, cheated vendors, swindled investors. He is not going to save anybody. He's only going to make it worse.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
That was David Cay Johnson, author of The Making of Donald Trump. Donald Trump epitomizes the dark ethic of corporate capitalism. Success, defined exclusively in monetary terms, is its own justification. Our brand alone is paramount. Truth, integrity, and the common good do not matter. This supreme cult of the self shares within it the classic traits of psychopaths: superficial charm, grandiosity, and self-importance, a need for constant stimulation, a penchant for lying and deception and manipulation, and the incapacity for remorse or guilt. Trump embodies all these qualities. His sordid business practices, his demeaning treatment of women as sexual commodities, and his utter disregard for the truth come from a bottomless narcissism. He is the consummate reality star, not only on television, but in his self-created version of life, the movie. He reflects back, in one of the most grotesque personifications, the sickness of a corporate culture that is swiftly destroying American society. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. See you next week.